hang on, in today's passage, is Jesus telling people not to wash their hands before they eat? Hi, I'm Justin Lee, and this is A Year of Bible. You know, one of the tricky things about reading old texts, including the Bible, is that we can so easily forget how different another culture was from ours. We can accidentally read our modern context into a situation with a totally different context, causing us to misread the situation and not understand what's actually going on. And today's chapter is a perfect example. So, as you'll remember, so far in Mark, we've seen multiple clashes between Jesus and the scribes and Pharisees, the influential religious leaders of his day. And here in Mark chapter 7, we see another clash, this time about washing hands before a meal. But as we read this bit about hand washing, if we want to understand what's going on, we need to not think of this in the modern context. You know, scrubbing with soap and clean running tap water to rid ourselves of germs and prevent illness. Yes, that is a very good practice, and we are privileged to have all those things. But remember, that's our modern context. Water in Jesus' day was a precious resource. People then weren't singing 2 happy birthdays while pumping foam onto their hands from a dispenser next to the hot and cold taps. They didn't have all that stuff. And even if they had, the germ theory of disease wouldn't be invented until, well, almost modern times. So we have to put all of that out of our minds. And instead, as you read about hand washing in this passage, imagine a religious purification ritual. Something that may or may not have done anything for germs, but was supposed to make your hands, your dishes, and even the couch you were sitting on ritually clean in the sight of God. At least, that was the tradition. So with that in mind, let's read. Then the Pharisees and some of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem gathered around Jesus, and they saw some of his disciples eating with hands that were defiled, that is, unwashed. Now, in holding to the tradition of the elders, the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat until they wash their hands ceremonially. And on returning from the market, they do not eat unless they wash. And there are many other traditions for them to observe, including the washing of cups, pitchers, kettles, and couches for dining. So the Pharisees and scribes questioned Jesus. Why do your disciples not walk according to the tradition of the elders? Instead, they eat with defiled hands. Jesus answered them. Isaiah prophesied correctly about you hypocrites, as it is written, "These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain. They teach as doctrine the precepts of men. You have disregarded the commandment of God to keep the tradition of men." He went on to say, "You neatly set aside the command of God to maintain your own tradition. For Moses said, 'Honor your father and your mother,' and anyone who curses his father or mother must be put to death. But you say that if a man says to his father or mother, 'Whatever you would have received from me is Korban,' that is, a gift devoted to God, he is no longer permitted to do anything for his father or mother. Thus you nullify the word of God by the tradition you have handed down, and you do so in many such matters." Once again, Jesus called the crowd to him and said, "All of you, listen to me and understand. Nothing that enters a man from the outside can defile him, but the things that come out of a man, these are what defile him." After Jesus had left the crowd and gone into the house, his disciples inquired about the parable. "Are you still so dull?" he asked. "Do you not understand? Nothing that enters a man from the outside can defile him, because it does not enter his heart, but it goes into the stomach and then is eliminated. Thus all foods are clean." He continued, "What comes out of a man, that is what defiles him. For from within the hearts of men come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, wickedness, deceit, debauchery, envy, slander, arrogance, and foolishness. All these evils come from within, and these are what defile a man." Jesus left that place and went to the region of Tyre. Not wanting anyone to know he was there, he entered a house, but was unable to escape their notice. Instead, a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit soon heard about Jesus, and she came and fell at his feet. Now she was a Greek woman of Syro-Phoenician origin, and she kept asking Jesus to drive the demon out of her daughter. "First, let the children have their fill," he said, "for it is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs." "Yes, Lord," she replied. "Even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." Then Jesus told her, "Because of this answer, you may go. The demon has left your daughter." And she went home and found her child lying on the bed, and the demon was gone. Then Jesus left the region of Tyre and went through Sidon to the Sea of Galilee and into the region of the Decapolis. Some people brought to him a man who was deaf and hardly able to speak, and they begged Jesus to place his hand on him. So Jesus took him aside privately, away from the crowd, and put his fingers into the man's ears. Then he spit and touched the man's tongue, and looking up to heaven, he sighed deeply and said to him, "Ephphatha," which means, "Be opened." Immediately the man's ears were opened, and his tongue was released, and he began to speak plainly. Jesus ordered them not to tell anyone. But the more he ordered them, the more widely they proclaimed it. The people were utterly astonished and said, "He has done all things well. He makes even the deaf hear and the mute speak." You might have heard that famous old joke about a woman preparing a pot roast for dinner while her young daughter watches and asks a million questions. As part of her process, the woman cuts the ends off the roast before putting it in the oven, and the girl asks, "Why did you cut the ends off?" And the woman says, "I'm not sure. That's just the way my mom taught me to make it." But the question sticks in her mind, so she calls her mom later, and she asks her why she always cut the ends off the roast before putting it in the oven. And her mom says, "Well, my mom was an excellent cook, and that's how she always did it, so I learned from her. I don't know why it works exactly, but it's always worked for me." Well, now the woman is curious. So she goes to visit her grandma, and she asks her, "Granny, do you remember when you made pot roast, you'd always cut the ends off before putting it in the oven? What's the point of that? Why does that help? Does it change how it cooks? Does it improve the flavor? What?" And her grandmother says, "My baking pan was too small. That was the only way it would fit." Sometimes traditions get handed down based on people using their best judgment to deal with the situations they're facing. And there can be a lot of wisdom in them. But if we become mindless slaves to those traditions, we can wind up foolishly wasting our time and energy for something that doesn't even make sense. Or, as was the case with the Pharisees, we can get our priorities all out of whack, putting the traditions ahead of more important things like caring for people. And we saw the other day with the Sabbath that the Pharisees were so concerned about following a rule from Scripture that they were willing to pass by someone in need to avoid potentially breaking the rule. Well, here we see another example of those mistaken priorities. In this case, the Pharisees' ritual hand washing, which wasn't something directly commanded by scriptures, but it had developed as a tradition, the tradition of the elders. The scriptures did have rules about ritual cleanliness, though, and the Pharisees were so concerned with not breaking those rules that they had built up traditions with additional sets of rules to make sure you didn't get too close to breaking the original rules. I've seen this described as building a fence around God's law. A more modern example might be if a Christian wants to avoid lust, say, because Jesus said not to lust. And so they say, well, R-rated movies often have nudity and sexual content that tempts me to lust, so I'm going to avoid any R-rated movies. Which, if that helps you, fine. But then it gradually becomes Christians shouldn't watch R-rated movies, and now it's a rule without context or exceptions. And then it becomes a judgment. Oh, she went to see that R-rated movie. Well, I thought she was a Christian. I guess not. And now this thing that started with good intentions, I want to avoid lust, has become something poisonous, fueling division and self-righteousness and pride. Have you seen examples of this in your own life? People so focused on following their own rules and sometimes on making sure everyone else follows their rules that they miss the more important stuff like kindness, generosity, human decency. I think right away of Penny's mom, Allison Janney's character, in the movie musical Hairspray. We see her in one scene reading the Bible, but it doesn't seem to have made her a kinder, more empathetic person. Instead, all her strict rules seem to have turned her into a bitter bigot. A bitter bigot with a penchant for permanently punishing her progeny.
You will never leave this room again. Devil child! Devil child!
And this, I think, is what Jesus is so upset about in this passage. It's not the fact that the Pharisees are doing this ceremonial hand washing. Fine. Great. It's the fact that they've gotten their priorities all wrong. They want everyone to know they're following all these rules, and they pride themselves on being better than everyone who's not following them. But they're missing the boat on some of the basics, including the treatment of their fellow human beings. The rules that were designed to be a fence around God's law, to keep them from even getting close to breaking a commandment, have ironically given them excuses to break God's commandments. And all of this is such a contrast with the story in this same chapter of the humble Greek woman who doesn't follow any of these laws, but is just grateful for any crumbs Jesus will toss her way. We can come back to that story in more depth another day. So Jesus responds to all of this by reminding us again that his priority is what's in our hearts. The scriptures had rules about clean and unclean food, but here Jesus says, look, it's not really the food that makes you unclean. It's the evil in your heart I'm concerned about. The pride, the selfishness, the sinfulness, the lack of concern for others. So, sure, keep worthwhile traditions. Avoid that movie if it'll cause you to lust. Cut the ends off the roast if it'll fit in the pan better. And by all means, wash your hands with soap and water. 2 happy birthdays. Just make sure that your priority isn't the tradition or the rule or what someone else is or isn't doing. Get to cleaning your heart out first. Then everything else will follow.